So my name is Jamie Talan, and I am the author of a new book on atypical dementias called Atypical Dementias. There we go. And my guest today is Laura, and Laura has a husband, Ted, who was diagnosed 8 years ago with frontotemporal dementia. And I met Laura in 2017. Laura, say hello to everybody.
Hello.
And Laura has been taking care of Ted at home. And as she's going to tell you, as we get into why I wrote this book, she's going to tell you that from the very beginning, when Ted was merely still Ted and not suffering from any real behavioral things, and how it's progressed over the years. And as all these atypicals are, everyone is different, right? I mean, every single person. I work with patients with posterior cortical atrophy, which is a visual and spatial dementia. And I came to know Laura and other people with atypical dementias back in 2017 when I was at University of California in San Francisco. There was a program for people who were not just neurologists, but people like me. I'm a science reporter. I spent my whole career studying the brain, and they had lawyers, they had a comedian, they had a lot of different people who were part of this dementia fellowship. And I got to spend every day in the clinic with patients and their caregivers, which is how Laura and I became friends. So when I left the fellowship, I wanted to give back, which is what we all like to do in the world. And I started a lecture series for patients with posterior cortical atrophy, which is an easier atypical dementia to do because people don't have the memory problems. They don't have the language problems. They don't have the behavioral problems. They have problems seeing what's in front of them. So they'll have problems reading, driving, obviously, it can't drive. They have problems knowing where their body is in space. And again, everybody is so different because some people have severe problems where they can't find a chair. So they'll sit on a table, they'll sit on somebody's lap. They'll, just a host of different problems. Calculations are just out the window. They can't, because, numbers are very spatial, right? I mean, that's what we now understand about this disease. It targets areas of the brain that see where we are in the world and what our eyes take in. A lot of these people have literally just gone from doctor to doctor, and that's with all of these conditions, right? Language dementias affects the language centers of the brain, but even in language dementias, it's so different. Some people nouns, some people verbs, some people pronouns, so they'll just forget, they'll look at you and they'll see you're a woman, but they'll say he. So they have problems with seeing, like they might know that this is something you talk on the phone with, but they will forget the word cell phone. So everybody is so different, and that condition can lead to aphasia. They don't know whether it's that people no longer can get the words out to communicate, or whether they're just become so isolated within themselves because they don't know which word to choose from in the brain, right? So, I mean, all of these conditions are very complicated, which is why I decided to write this book, because my patients with posterior cortical atrophy were like, well, it would be nice if there was a book that would, kind of explain these conditions. And I didn't just want to do one condition, because at UCSF, and I worked with patients with FTD, I work with patients with even FTD, there's behavioral and then non-behavioral, which happens to be the language dementias that kind of fall into that frontotemporal lobar degeneration. So it's all very complicated. So what I decided to do is write about every single one of these conditions and tell stories. So I interviewed you, Laura. I interviewed about 3 people for every condition, some of them more. And many of them were people I met after I did my fellowship, and some were in the fellowship. And during my fellowship, I wrote a blog. I think I did a blog on you and Ted, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
you did. And you met Ted. Don't forget.
Yeah, I met Ted. And when I met him, if you remember, there was really nothing wrong with him.
I know.
You know, he was just.
Well, there was something wrong with him.
There was, but nothing that like.
Fake it, or he could, you wouldn't think anything was wrong with him.
Right. So take us back to, as a caregiver, you've gone through a lot since we've known each other. Take us back to when it first started, and what did you see? How did you know there was even something wrong?
Right. So I think Jamie, how it first started was, I mean, Ted and I have been married 28 years. And then we were diagnosed 8 years ago. So 20 years into our marriage, but things had started coming up before then. And what the biggest thing was communication. I mean, Ted and I love each other dearly, have a a great relationship, and always have. We have 2 children, and we both were working, and just some little notices of not. He wasn't forgetting things. He was not someone who was always very in tune with me and very concerned about how I thought, or one in my opinion was kind of like, it would just kind of just non-engaged, unless I pressed him to be engaged. And so I started noticing little things like this, and I reached out to, he's an owner of a construction company, and I reached out to one of the other owners, and I said, listen, Ted just seems kind of short with me. He just kind of this, that. I was naming all these things, and he said, yep, we're seeing that at work too. And they're like, this is not Ted. And I go, I know it's not Ted. And I can remember telling Ted that I talked to one of the owners, and he was mad. And I said, Teddy, there's just something going on. I asked him if he was having an affair. I asked him if he was, I thought he was going through a midlife crisis. I just didn't know. So he was very amicable to see doctors, and our family doctor he went to by himself. And, that doctor put him on an antidepressant. We had just lost one of his beloved Labrador retrievers, and his mother had passed. Now, when Ted acted more upset about the lab dying than his mother dying, that was kind of odd. But I thought maybe he'd already grieved her. They put him on an antidepressant, and it seemed like the new Ted was back. I mean, it seemed like that really, I'm thinking a chemical imbalance, and that, kickstarted him and got him in the right way. And it lasted about 30 days. And then kind of just went back to the other thing. We went back to the doctor. He said, listen, I think that maybe you need to go see a psychiatrist. Maybe this is bipolar, all these different things. And Ted would always say to our doctor, he said, Tim, just MRI my brain. And for the months leading up to this, Tim said, I can't just MRI your brain, Ted. You're a healthy guy. There's a healthy guy. There's nothing wrong with your brain. Ted kept insisting. They finally did it. And the results showed white matter disease. It said white matter disease or multiple sclerosis, or, 2 or 3 things that it could be. Ted was relieved in that he's like, Laura, all this, not complaining, but all this, you pointing out what I'm doing, not doing, this and that. So here's the reason. We didn't know what the reason was. And then a friend of mine hooked us up with the neurologist at the University of Kentucky, Greg Jica. And Greg then in turn hooked us up with Dr. Bruce Miller out at UCF. And he was diagnosed with frontotemporal degeneration of the behavioral variant. And so what that meant was Ted would do things that was not his personality, and nothing mean. I mean, Ted is and was always a very kind, nice guy, but he would do some compulsive things, like walk around our farm and pick up sticks and like just burn things. He got really big into collecting coins or looking at coins, just things that were just not his nature. So when we met with Greg Jica, and before we went out west, he said, listen, this is what I think it is. and this is not good. It's, it's going to be ugly. It's going to be, get your affairs in order. I can remember him saying that. I was like, who are you to tell me to get my affairs in order? My husband's sitting right here. He can still do everything that he, couldn't do or could still do. Ted went out to San Francisco by himself for a week, did a ton of testing, came back. Then we both went out there a couple of months later, and then it was diagnosed. And like the questions that these doctors were asking Ted, like I can remember being in a big room with all these doctors, and they asked Ted to go up to the board and draw a cat or something, just to draw a cat. And Ted was always very linear and great with numbers, and he went up there, and I don't know what the heck he drew, but it was nothing near a cat. And I was like, but he didn't even know that it looked like a blob, so that was just kind of concerning. And since then, it's just been a very slow decline. Too slow. It's too slow because he is not living. He's not living. He's alive, but not living.
Yeah.
Yep.
And what does that look like? I mean, how does he spend his days? How has it, is he aware of you? Is he aware of his surroundings?
Yeah. So, the Ted how it declined, he went to adult daycare for a while and was fine. It stimulated him and gave him something to do. And I truly believe that folks that every day have to fight their brain or just it's so taxing just to figure out what to do or what to say. Ted spends now, he's mobile. He spends probably 22 hours a day in bed. He knows where his room is in the house. He can still climb stairs, and that's where he feels the most comfortable. He'll go on walks with us or go on drives, but when he comes in, he goes upstairs and lays down. He's not always sleeping. I think he's just resting his brain. But I'll get him up to eat. I don't think Ted would eat on his own. We went through stages where he had oral fixations, where he was putting everything in his mouth, from hammers to paint to picking up a nail, just crazy stuff. And so now, he's pretty much on his teeth. I mean, going to the dentist, that's just not going to happen. So I give him a lot of soft foods. He is incontinent, double incontinent. He cannot do any of his personal hygiene things at all, but he will stand in the shower and let, me wash him off. And I think I told you this crazy, gross thing that has started happening since Ted is in pull-ups. If he defecates in the middle of the night, of course, there's no alarm that goes off that says, he's pooped his pants like a baby or something. I can go in there the next morning and there will be human feces all over, in his hands, on his mouth, just because he doesn't know.
Right.
And he's putting it in his mouth. And that's just recently been one of the things that we're having to deal with, in the last, I'd say 3 months. For some reason, in the last week, what has just happened is whenever I go in to get him, he will have his blanket, whatever blanket's on him, and he'll just have it in his mouth. I don't know if he's chewing it. I don't know if he's sucking on it. But that's new. And, of course, he's lost a ton of weight. The doctors can't believe that he still has as much muscle as he does, that he can get up and go down and walk. And we have a farm, and we'll walk on the farm, and his gait is good. He doesn't stagger or have an odd gait. So, like you said early on, everyone is different. And when I was reading your book, what I found a lot of similarities of symptoms through all the people that you talked about, but they all had different diagnoses. And I think I told you, I mean, I don't know how many of the people that you wrote about are still alive. I don't think a lot of them are.
No, they are.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, like probably half of them.
Half of them, okay. But Ted's was born in 1960, so he's going to be 63 this year, and it's just young, and this has been going on so long. It's hard to remember how it was before.
Yeah.
and especially for my children.
And is he able to talk or?
No, so the talking, and I tell the story to people that there was a stage that when I would take him to daycare, adult daycare, we'd be drive. It was like a 40-minute drive, and he would talk and talk and talk. And I couldn't tell you what he was jabbering about, but I can remember, well, will you just shut up? And me thinking, I can't wait till he gets to the phase where he's not talking. And that has just, since I'm with him every day, I really can't tell you when it phased out, but yeah, he's pretty much nonverbal. He can say, okay, I'll say, Teddy, you want to go do something? And he'll say, okay. So, I mean, okay is his words. Or does he know that I'm Laura? He doesn't know I'm Laura, but he knows who I am. Like he can't name me, but he knows who I am. Like if Jamie, if you were taking care of him, I think he'd be off. I mean, I want to believe that. I guess I could test it. I could have some random person here and say, Ted, and see who he gravitates towards. But I do think that he knows the familiarity of me and the children.
Yeah. So when you need to go do something, when you need to go for work, if you have consulting to do your kids watch?
Yeah. So he doesn't, we've got cameras in the house. He doesn't get up out of bed by himself. He just doesn't. I mean, I can go and be away for 3 hours and come back. Now I feel more comfortable when one of the children are here, or if we're going to be at the family function or a funeral or a wedding, I will get somebody to come stay with him. And he's really no trouble to take care of because he's in bed and can't ask for anything, or, and of course, keep him hydrated. He doesn't eat a lot. I don't know. I mean, it's not a way your brain shouldn't outlive your body.
Yeah. Yeah. We've talked about that. We've talked about, I know, you've taken such beautiful care of him, and you're, you just wonder, like, how long does this go on? And not for you, for Ted. But
Absolutely, for Ted.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I can, when we were first diagnosed, we looked in suicide-assisted states, and then at that time, we went all the way to okay, you got to buy property, you have to be a resident so many years, and the more we researched and the more people we talked to, when it would come time, Ted wouldn't be eligible because Ted's disease is not eligible to do that. Although Ted can put his pills in his mouth himself. I have to hand them to him. He couldn't, even though he wrote it down, and even though he told every doctor, there's his condition, there's nothing you can do for him. And we have animals that are in better condition than what Ted's life is, that it's humane to put him down. And it's just mind-boggling. Ted never wanted to live like this. He's not living. He is not living.
Yeah. No,
Just,
I know. Yeah. There is a woman in the book whose husband made the decision that he would go overseas and
Netherlands, right?
And yeah. And his life, shorten his life after this disease. And it was really just really heartfelt, but it made sense. I've always been the kind of person where, like I say, because I lost my brother to a stranger murder, and he was on life support, that one night his brain was dead, but, and I said, no, he wouldn't want to live this way. He was only 18. I made that decision for him, or my parents had to, but I've always said to my husband and my kids, if something like this ever happens, no, I don't want to live this way.
But you realize, Jamie, if something like this happened, if you were Ted, there's nothing, however many times you told.
No, I know that. I know that. And even people, and even in states like Washington and, I think Oregon, I forget what states have, even there, when somebody does go through this process, many of them just back out because it's so arduous.
Mhm.
oh, you've got to get 3 doctors and they have to all decide, and then they have to, test you and grill you, and it's too much.
Yeah.
It's just too much.
Yeah, but the difference is the patients that are eligible to take medications that are going to end their life, assisted suicide, they actually can do it anyway, right? I mean,
Yeah.
they
Yeah.
can do it anyway. They can, if they're most of them, I think, are cancer patients who have got high doses of whatever available. They can
Right.
do it,
Right.
and I can't leave I couldn't leave a bottle of pills out and let Teddy think they're Tic Tacs, and just start
Of
taking them.
course not. Yeah. Yeah.
But if he was in his right mind and
Right.
he knew it, yeah, he would have, it
Yeah.
would have, yeah.
But you're just, I'm just always in awe of you and your just, your caregiving. It's just
Well,
arduous. It's just like,
I think you get
you
used
just,
to it. I think you get
yeah.
used to it, and there's a lot of humor. I mean, my children, we have there's so much crazy stuff that happens that we just have to laugh about it.
Yeah.
And my daughter has been a huge support, and she's fabulous with her father. And I hope, and I know, because I talked to a doctor a couple of weeks ago, and I said, whenever he dies, he goes, Laura, he goes, I believe you. And he goes, and probably your children have already grieved Ted quite a bit. And he said, but no, he said, when it happens, it's going to hit you. He goes, it's going to
Yeah.
hit you again. So I think about my children who won't be able to experience the things that young adults, Carter's in medical school, Caroline's getting to graduate and going to graduate school, just all those things
Yeah.
that they miss out on having Ted, because he was so much fun and he loved them so much. And, I just, my heart hurts more for them than it does me. And,
Yeah.
and all of our heart hurts the most for Ted.
Of course. There's a book by Pauline Boss. It's about grieving when the person you love is gone, but still here.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. And that's such an interesting concept, because like you said, you began grieving, and he began grieving when you got the diagnosis 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in what you told me, and that's in the book, is that, he brought the letter from the doctor to a date that you were having, and he's like, and he pushed it in front of you and he said, there's something wrong with my brain.
Yep.
And he was both of you were almost like glad that it wasn't that he was having an affair, or that, that you were right about, that something was wrong. And I think
he was more relieved, because I was still not on board with it. I was still not on board, but in hindsight, I so wish it would have been an affair.
Yeah, I know.
Anything, when you have a doctor tell you, well, you're going to wish you was hit by a truck. It's like, oh, I get it now. I get it.
Yeah. There's this one story in the book where this woman, her husband began like seeing, he was spending a lot of time online, and he worked in a school, and he wasn't even that old. And she would find these like receipts where he had given money. I think you probably read that in the book, to these women in Guyana, or somebody in Guyana. And it just kept escalating. And it turned out, that he literally, was arrested for, bank fraud charges. And he, didn't understand any of this. Eventually lost his job, and his wife left him because she just thought, she didn't know what it was. But she's fabulous. And she worked for, she works for a medical company that, does meetings. And she remembered this guy at Mass General who studied frontotemporal dementia. And the day he died at Bellevue Hospital, where, he was, admitted, and a patient in his room, just killed him, just was psychotic and killed him. And at
Wait,
that
that's how he really
moment,
died? Wait, that's how he
yeah,
really died? Okay.
yeah. At that moment, she called this doctor, Brad Dickerson at Mass General, and she said, "I know you studied FTD, and I know this is, but I'd like to have an autopsy." And it turned out that this poor guy had frontotemporal dementia. And she, she had no idea, right?
Yeah.
She just thought it was just something else. And I think a lot of people just go on this like roller coaster to find out what's wrong, right? I mean, you got it pretty quickly, but other people can take 5 years or
Yeah.
more, or sometimes never. Sometimes death is where
Or they also say like you've a lot of times had it for at least 5 years when you've been diagnosed.
right. No, it's
So
interesting, and no one knows why it happens in midlife. Like we're all led to believe, oh, Alzheimer's, it's an old age disease, but these atypical dementias, including early Alzheimer's, that's not caused by a known gene, right? For early
right.
Alzheimer's, it happens in midlife. And we just don't know why. Now that we're looking at the brain over time, we can say, oh, there are, there were hints
Oh yeah.
in,
Oh
in
yeah.
your brain 10 years ago, but it took that time for the pathology to build up for it to become a clinical syndrome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And looking back at once he's diagnosed, and I've done this several times, and I've looked back to where he's, said something funny or said something when we were around a group of people that's kind of not like him, but it's never offensive. And I'm thinking, yeah, there's just a couple of incidences that I can reflect back on that now I blame it on the onset of that.
Yeah.
Just like little flashes of it that would soon just completely take over his brain. And I ask all the doctors, I mean, when I say, how is this going to end? They say, well, he could get pneumonia, he could get a urinary tract infection, and Ted's had COVID, he's had urinary tract infections that we haven't really treated, and he's just very healthy, and that's the worst thing going for him is he's so healthy, even though he's lost a ton of weight and doesn't know anything about anything. His body's still pretty healthy.
Yeah. So what was it like for you when you began to tell people what's going on with Ted?
I can remember that we had a close group of friends that we went to one of their house. We said, listen, we need to talk to you. We went to one of their houses on a Sunday, and we told them, and Ted was like upbeat, not like I'm going to beat this, but he was just kind of upbeat, like, it is what it is, and then family, my side of the family who just adores Ted. I mean, we're pretty in sync with everything that we were going through. And then of course his work, knew, but Ted knows so many people in our area that I was very keen on protecting him and protecting his image and protecting him, because he's always just a gregarious, really fun, nice guy. And I find it mostly with men. Men can't handle it, and I mean, but I get calls, how's Ted, or he's not forgotten. That's for sure. But he is not, we haven't been in public in years. Yeah. And I'm just not gonna do that. And the other thing that I'm not gonna do is I'm not gonna put Ted in a nursing home. I mean, I'm just not. I'll do what I can to take care of him. And I think when he gets to the point where I can't take care of him, that's when hospice will be able to help me more.
Yeah. Have you been in touch with them?
Actually this week. So this week, he's kind of in the system. So I called, and they're going to come out next week and do an evaluation, just kind of see where he is. There's so many things he can't do, but he does just enough not to be a hospice patient.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll
Well,
see.
they'll make that determination.
Right, right. I know any of my doctors would write whatever or do whatever I needed them to do to help, but there's just nothing they can
Yeah.
do.
So lessons learned for you
Mhm.
from this that you can impart to other caregivers.
The first lesson that I learned, and this is, you'll have a divide here, but I legally divorced Ted 3 years ago. And the main reason I did that was because if it gets to a point where Ted would have to be taken care of by the federal government, we would have too much income. So during COVID, we divorced in paper only, because he still lives here.
Yeah.
And what that does is that separates our assets. So if something happened where it got very bad, the government can't take my house, my kids' college funds, all that stuff,
Yeah.
which is asinine. I mean, we worked so hard our whole lives to get this, and then if he lives 20 more years, so with that, I set up a healthcare trust for Ted, and that trust is paying for Ted's needs. So that was the biggest thing that I learned, and I learned it myself. I mean, my attorney didn't even kind of realize, like, oh, that's a smart way to do this. So if not, you don't have to have a lot of money for it to. What's important is you divide the assets to get that person to be at a level that when it comes time, that the federal government will take care of them.
Yeah.
And it's not coming out of your pocket to pay your mortgage or your gas or your food. And I don't see how people that are older do it. I mean, because I think that when the person dies, when the loved one that has this disease dies, the other one's left destitute because there's no money left.
Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think the other lesson learned, well, and I don't think this is a lesson. I just think this is a testament to how much we loved each other, and specifically how much I loved him, is that I just knew it wasn't him. I mean, I just knew it wasn't him. And Ted knew enough to know it wasn't him too, although we didn't listen, right? Because he was walking and talking and just, it's just his behavior. So, I mean, Ted, why can't you just quit doing that? Or why can't you just start doing this again? So it was just his behavior. He wasn't having trouble with words. His memory wasn't an issue until about probably 3 years ago. His memory became an issue. So I think when something happens in someone's life that it's a kind of a drastic change. I mean, I would always think drugs or alcohol, or, somebody's gone through a huge midlife crisis where somebody's died or something like that. And now I listen to some talk radio, or I hear people call in and they say, oh, my husband is, and I'm thinking, God, it so could be that, it so could be something with the brain. When you've just beat your head against the wall and gone to every doctor, and, nobody thinks of that. Nobody thinks of that.
Something else in the book that I touch on, and that is many people who develop so-called psychiatric symptoms in midlife, like nothing, there've been nothing, and all of a sudden in the 40s or 50s, you're diagnosed with some like depression or bipolar.
Bipolar,
Yeah. Then, and that, like, now that they're looking at that, and then they're looking forward and they see the brain of that person 20 years later, and they see, whoa, the pathology is Alzheimer's, or the pathology is frontotemporal dementia, and this is new because we haven't been able to scan the brain.
Right.
So we're looking backwards at these, midlife psychiatric illnesses, and there's, a lot of compelling evidence that these are underlying neurodegenerative conditions that they just haven't been diagnosed yet, which is exactly what happened in that person who got a criminal record,
Right. And, and the other thing about it is, like you said, you really don't know about it until you have a baseline. And people aren't just MRIing their brains, when they're 20. So if something happens, they
Right.
can have a baseline when they're 40.
Right.
So you really, so you don't know, was it there when you're 20 and it's
Right.
not when you're 30, but now when you're 40. So yeah. And that's why, I will say that, Ted's brain will go to the University of Kentucky, which will work in conjunction with San Francisco, but they find out you really don't know for sure until the person is
Right.
dead.
Yeah.
All these cognitive tests that they give Ted are the same cognitive tests that they give every other form of dementia.
Right.
So
And eventually, I think it was like 2 years after I met you that they finally just said, you don't need to come back because it was a research study.
Yeah.
And they knew that he could no longer perform in those kind of tests that they could.
Right.
And I think, very few people ever come to autopsy. So I think it's so much more acceptable now with people with these diseases to just say, hey, I want to give back. I want to understand, what actually is wrong. And they do have an autopsy. And the autopsies, interestingly enough, and it comes across in the book, not all, like, there are surprises, like you said, like you're reading the book and like Ted has these visual things and he's got the spatial things and he's got the, that you see little bits and pieces from all these conditions. And so it is important. But even at autopsy, you might be surprised that he might have a secondary diagnosis of,
Right. And
or there may be pathology in the language areas of the brain, which is why he no longer is,
I will have to say that all the doctors that saw Ted and then saw his MRIs with as much atrophy as he had in his brain, they were all very surprised of how high functioning he was, and one of his neurologists who I saw in January, when we walked in, he actually apologized to me because I probably just looked like and he said, Laura, he said, I was looking back at Ted's records and reading everything. He said, and I wrote when I first met you, he said, I said 18 to 24 months. And that had been like 7 years ago. I said, yeah, Greg, you're missed that one. And he said, he goes, I know, I'm sorry. And I said, well, there's, nothing you can do about it.
Yeah. At least he knew how to send you to the right people to get.
Absolutely.
To get a diagnosis.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Which is really important because so many people are not specialists. I'm just always amazed at how one of the first people I met when I moved to Boise, she clearly, she was in my gym class and she was kind of dancing her own way and she was wearing a purple Alzheimer's Association. And I'm like, do you volunteer for the Alzheimer's Association? She goes, oh no, I have Alzheimer's. And I was just like, no, she doesn't, and because she's so young, she was like my age, right? I was like, huh? And this was 13 years ago. And I just moved to Boise. I was going to do a story for the local newspaper on her. And I went to see her neurologist and I said, just everything she told me. She has numbers, problems, this and that, visual, spatial. It was PCA, posterior cortical atrophy. Her neurologist never even heard of it. And I went so far, Laura, as to introduce him to a specialist, a neurologist in New York, to communicate with him.
Yeah.
Never did it. So she literally, and her family told me, Jamie, she might have PCA, but she just wants to believe she has Alzheimer's. So just let it go.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay,
Is she still living?
No.
How long did she pass?
She died during COVID and she ended up in a memory care facility. And I went to visit her there because I asked her boyfriend, how's she doing? And he said she's there. And this was before COVID. And I went to see her and she's still she was so sweet. She was always sweet, just so sweet. And she just, I had to lead her to the chair and she, I think she knew who I was, right? Mm-hmm. Because she asked me about the gym, if I'm still going to the gym and but she clearly was visually impaired, totally visually impaired.
Right.
And she was living the best life she could there,
Yeah.
and it
So
it's always
how old
sad.
was she when she passed?
My age, well, she was my age, and so this was like 2 years, she was like maybe 64.
Yeah.
63.
Crazy.
And my daughter's partner's mother was diagnosed with a language dementia, and I helped get her diagnosed, and she passed away at 61. So she was in her 50s when this happened. And,
Wow.
you know, these are just devastating, which is, you know, for every reason I
Right.
wrote this book, you know, for every reason, to help people, to educate people, to let them know, you know, you're not alone. There are other people like Laura and all these caregivers who are out there who, you know, are taking care of their loved ones, and then their loved ones are
Oh,
alive and functioning, and, you know, with disabilities.
yeah.
Anyway, so thank you for
Thank
talking to
you.
me about
Well,
this.
thanks for writing the
And
book.
oh, thank you. And if anybody wants to know more, you could go to atypicaldementias.org, and you can learn more about that. And Laura, thank you.
Yeah,
Anything
you're
else you want?
welcome. And if anybody wants, I mean, and I'm happy to talk to anyone. So if anyone contacts you, you know, through your site and wants to talk, I mean, I can certainly listen. I mean, I pretty much have been through it all at this point. Now there's always
Yeah.
something new, but gosh, it can't get much worse. I mean, the best thing now is death. And so I just don't think it can get much worse.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you have my prayers,
Thank
and
you.
we'll always stay in touch, and
Yes.
I will speak to you soon.
All right. Thank you. Bye, Jamie.
Thank you, honey.